Learn English through stories. C37 PDF. Adopted and modified by Kulwant Singh Sandhu. Content. 1. Mini Stories 1. 2. Picture Dictionary page. 1. Mini Stores 1. By Emma Hill. Story 1. 3 young men were playing with a gun in a street in a quiet area of the town after dark when one of them fired it by mistake without aiming it at anything. The bullet broke a window in an old lady's house. The young men made off at once when they saw the damage they had done, but the old lady looked out of a window when she heard the explosion, and she recognized one of them as the son of a man and woman who lived not far from her. The old lady complained to the police, and a detective came to her house. The old lady gave him a detailed account of everything that had happened, and then the detective asked her if she knew where the young man lived. The old lady told him that too, so the detective went to the young man's house. He and his companions tried to hide, but the detective found them and the gun and took them to the police station. There his chief officer questioned the young men to find out which of them owned the gun, but none of them was willing to say. The young man who owned the gun did not dare to admit that he did, because he did not have a license for it. At last, the chief officer decided to put an end to the conversation, so he turned to the detective and demanded to know whether he had got an officer's permission to take the gun away from the young man who owned it. The detective felt anxious when he heard this question. "No, sir," he answered nervously, "I didn't get it." "In that case," the officer declared angrily, "you were quite wrong to take it away from him. You'd better return it immediately or there'll be trouble." This made the young men smile happily at each other, and as soon as the detective held the gun out and said, "Here you are," one of them put his hand out in order to get it back. That is how the officer finally discovered whom the gun belonged to. Story 2. Mr. Gray traveled a lot on business. He sold machines of various kinds to farmers. It was not really a very exciting job, but Mr. Gray had always been interested in farming, and he was quite satisfied with his life. He had a big car and usually enjoyed driving it long distances, but he was quite satisfied to go by train sometimes too, especially when the weather was bad. He was a little frightened of driving in rain or snow, and it was less tiring to sit comfortably in a train and look out of the window without being worried about how one was going to get to the next place. One of Mr. Gray's problems was often where to stay when he reached some small place in the country. He did not expect great comfort and wonderful food, but he found it annoying when he was given a cold room, and there was no hot water or good food after a long and tiring day. Late one winter evening, Mr. Gray arrived at a small railway station. The journey by train that day had not been at all interesting, and Mr. Gray was cold and tired and hungry. He was looking forward to a simple but satisfying meal by a brightly burning fire, and then a hot bath and comfortable bed. While he was walking to the taxi rank, he said to a local man who was also walking there, "As this is my first visit to this part of the country and I was in too much of a hurry to find out about hotels before I left home, I would very much like to know how many you have here." The local man answered, "We have 2. "And which of the 2 would you advise me to go to?" Mr. Gray asked then. The local man scratched his head for a few moments and then answered, "Well, it's like this, whichever one you go to, you'll be sorry you didn't go to the other." Story 3. Mrs. Hammond was old and blind, but she was determined to do everything for herself. She even used to go for walks alone from her cottage once a day for exercise and fresh air, and found her way by touching things with her white stick. She learned where everything was, so she never lost her way. But then one day some men came and cut down some of the familiar pine trees at the side of one of the paths which she followed. When she reached that place that evening, she did not feel the trees with her stick, so she was in difficulties. She stopped for a minute and listened, but she did not hear any other people, so she went ahead for a kilometer or 2, and then she heard water beneath her. "Water," she said aloud, and paused. Am I lost? I suppose so. I must be on a bridge, I suppose, and there must be a river under me. I've been told that there's a river in this part of the country, but I don't know its exact position. How am I going to get back to my cottage from here?" All at once she heard a man's friendly voice near her. It said, "Excuse me, can I help you?" "How kind of you," Mrs. Hammond answered. "Yes, please. I'm lost. Some of the trees which I follow when I go for my walk every evening have been removed today, and if I hadn't been lucky enough to come across you, I don't know what I'd have done. Can you please help me to get home?" "Certainly," the man answered. "Where do you live?" Mrs. Hammond told him, and they began walking. The man took Mrs. Hammond to her cottage, and she invited him in and gave him some coffee and a piece of cake. She told the man how grateful she was that she had met him. "Don't thank me," he answered. "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" Mrs. Hammond said. "Whatever for?" "Well," the man answered quietly, "I was balanced on the edge of that bridge for ages in the dark, because I was trying to make up my mind to throw myself into the river and drown myself, but I'm not going to do it now." Story 4. Jim lived with his parents until he was 21 years old, and then he got a job in the office of a big factory in another town, so he left home. He found a comfortable little flat which had 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a bathroom, and he lived there on his own. At first he cleaned it himself, but he did not want to have to go on doing this, so he determined to find someone else to do it instead of him. He asked a lot of his fellow workers at the factory what they did about this, and at last one of the men said, "Oh, Mrs. Roper comes and cleans my flat regularly. She washes the dishes, irons my shirts and keeps the place neat and tidy and so on. I'll introduce her to you, if you like. She's a charming old lady, she does her best, but she hasn't got much energy." "Well, you'd better ask her to come and see me, please," Jim answered. So the next evening Mrs. Roper came to see him, and she agreed with pleasure to come to his flat every morning for an hour. After she had been working for Jim for 2 weeks, he looked at the mirror in his bedroom and thought, "That mirror looks very dusty. Mrs. Roper's forgotten to clean it. I can write on it with my finger." He wrote a message in the dust, "I'm coughing whenever I breathe because everything in this room is very dusty." He came home at 7 o'clock that evening, and when he had eaten his supper, he went into his bedroom and looked at the mirror. "That silly woman still hasn't cleaned it," he said to himself. "All it needs is a cloth." But then he bent down and saw a bottle in front of the mirror. "I didn't put that bottle there," he thought. "Mrs. Roper must have left it." He picked the bottle up and looked at it carefully. "She's written some words on it," he said to himself. He read the words. They were, "cough medicine." Story 5. Matthew lived in a big city, and his hair was always cut by the same hairdresser. Matthew went to him once a month. He was allowed 1 hour for his lunch every day, and on the mornings when his hair was going to be cut, he made himself some sandwiches to eat in the hairdresser's. The hairdresser had a very small shop near Matthew's office, and he worked alone, but he always cut Matthew's hair exactly as Matthew liked it, and while he was doing it, the 2 men talked about football or cricket. But the hairdresser was an old man, and one day, when Matthew was sitting in his chair, and his hair was being cut as usual, the old man said to him, "Matthew, I'm going to be 65 years old next month, so I'm going to retire. I'm going to sell my shop to a young man who wants to be a hairdresser. The shop's being paid for by the young man's father." Matthew was very sad to hear this, because he enjoyed talking to the old man, and he was also worried that his hair would not be cut as well by the new young man as it had been for so many years by his old friend. He went to the shop again the next month, and the new man was there. He cut Matthew's hair, but he did it very badly. The next month, Matthew went into the shop again. The young man asked him how he would like his hair cut, and Matthew answered, "Please cut it very short on the right side, but leave it as it is on the left. It must cover my ear, on top, cut all the hair away in the middle, but leave a piece at the front which can hang down to my chin." The young man was very surprised when he heard this. "But sir," he said, "I can't cut your hair like that." Why not? Matthew asked. That's how you cut it last time. 2. Picture dictionary page.